What if the thoughts inside your head are not actually yours? Right now, as you listen to these words, a stream of thoughts is moving through your mind. Some are related to what you're hearing. Others have nothing to do with this video. A memory, a worry, a plan for tomorrow, a random image, a forgotten conversation. Thoughts appear continuously, one after another, filling the space we call consciousness. Most of us never question where they come from. We assume they belong to us because they happen inside our minds. But consider something strange. Can you predict your next thought before it appears? Not its general topic, not its emotional tone, the exact thought itself. Can you know what you are about to think before you think it? Try it. For the next few seconds, wait for your next thought to arrive. Watch carefully. Observe the process. And notice something peculiar. You are not creating the thought. You are discovering it. It simply appears, unannounced, uninvited, from somewhere beyond conscious awareness. The thought arrives first. The feeling that I thought this comes second. This raises an unsettling possibility. What if the voice in your head is not the author of your thoughts? What if it is merely the narrator? For centuries, philosophers, scientists, and spiritual traditions have wrestled with a question that most people never even ask. Where do thoughts come from? And more importantly, who is doing the thinking? The answer may challenge one of the deepest assumptions you have ever made about yourself, because the evidence increasingly suggests that the mind is far stranger than it appears. Your thoughts may not belong to you in the way you imagine. The voice inside your head may not be the thinker. The self you identify with may be arriving after the fact, watching, interpreting, explaining, but not creating. And if that is true, then one of the most intimate parts of your identity may be built upon an illusion so convincing that almost nobody notices it until they begin looking closely. Tonight we are going to look closely, because the question is no longer, what am I thinking? The question is, why did that thought appear at all? And once you begin asking that question, the mind starts to look very different. For most of human history, thoughts seemed simple. You think because you are the thinker. The relationship appears obvious. A thought exists. Therefore, someone must have created it. But the closer we examine this assumption, the more mysterious it becomes. Imagine sitting quietly in a room. No phone, no conversation, no distractions. Simply observing your own mind. At first, nothing unusual seems to happen. Thoughts continue flowing exactly as they always have. But after a while, a strange pattern begins to emerge. You notice that thoughts arrive spontaneously. A memory surfaces. A song begins playing in your mind. An old embarrassment reappears. A completely unrelated image flashes across awareness. None of these events seem consciously chosen. They simply happen. In fact, if thoughts were truly under conscious control, you should be able to decide exactly what to think next. Not influence, not guide. Decide. Yet this ability appears strangely absent. You can choose to focus attention. You can choose a task. You can decide to solve a problem. But the actual thoughts involved in that process still emerge on their own. The words of a sentence appear. The solution appears. The idea appears. And only afterward do you become aware of them. This observation has fascinated philosophers for centuries. Some traditions even built entire systems of meditation around it. They encourage practitioners to stop identifying with thoughts and simply watch them. What they discovered was surprising. Thoughts behaved less like deliberate creations and more like weather patterns. They arrived, they changed, they disappeared, all without requiring a conscious author. Modern neuroscience has only deepened the mystery. When scientists observe brain activity, They often find unconscious processing occurring long before a person becomes aware of a thought or decision. Entire networks are working behind the scenes, analyzing information, predicting outcomes, generating possibilities. By the time a thought reaches awareness, much of the work has already been done. Consciousness appears to receive the finished product, not the manufacturing process. This creates a profound inversion of how most people imagine the mind. We assume consciousness generates thoughts, but what if consciousness is where thoughts appear? Like a stage rather than a factory, a place where mental events become visible after they have already been created elsewhere. If this sounds strange, consider dreams. During sleep, entire worlds emerge without conscious control. Characters speak, stories unfold, emotions arise, yet the dreaming mind experiences them as though they are happening in real time. Only after waking do we realize that the process was unfolding automatically. Perhaps waking thought is not as different as we imagine. Perhaps consciousness is not the source of thought. Perhaps it is the place where thought becomes known. And if that is true, then the question becomes unavoidable. If you are not creating your thoughts, who is? The human mind presents itself as a kingdom ruled by a conscious self. A thought appears, a decision is made, an action follows. And throughout the process, it feels as though there is someone in control, someone steering the ship, someone sitting behind the eyes, directing the flow of experience. But this feeling may be one of the most convincing illusions the brain has ever created. Because when neuroscientists began investigating how decisions and thoughts actually emerge, they discovered something deeply unexpected. The conscious mind seems to arrive late. In the 1980s, neuroscientist Benjamin Libet conducted a series of experiments that would become some of the most discussed in modern psychology. Participants were asked to perform a simple task. Whenever they felt the urge, they would move a finger. At the same time, researchers measured activity inside the brain. The expectation seemed obvious. First, a conscious decision. Then, brain activity. Then, movement. But that is not what happened. The brain began preparing the movement hundreds of milliseconds before participants became consciously aware of deciding. The decision appeared to begin unconsciously. Only later did consciousness report the feeling. I chose this. Over the following decades, similar experiments became increasingly sophisticated. Using modern brain imaging, researchers found that patterns of neural activity could sometimes predict decisions several seconds before people believed they had consciously made them. The implications were unsettling. The conscious self appeared less like a commander and more like a commentator, not issuing orders, explaining them. This phenomenon extends far beyond simple movements. Consider language. When you speak, do you consciously select every word, every sentence, every grammatical structure? Of course not. Words emerge automatically. You discover what you are about to say while saying it. The same process occurs while reading. The same process occurs while solving problems. The same process occurs while thinking. The brain is continuously generating possibilities beneath conscious awareness. Most of this activity never reaches the surface. Only a small fraction becomes visible inside consciousness. And when it does, the mind immediately constructs a story. I thought this. I decided this. I wanted this. But these explanations may be arriving after the event itself, like a news reporter describing a game that has already been played. One of the most fascinating examples comes from split brain research. In certain patients, the connection between the brain's hemispheres was surgically separated to treat severe epilepsy. What researchers discovered challenged basic assumptions about personal identity. When one hemisphere initiated an action, the other hemisphere often had no access to the true reason, yet it still produced an explanation, confidently, automatically, without hesitation. The brain seemed incapable of admitting, "I don't know." Instead, it generated a story, a plausible narrative, an interpretation that made the action appear intentional. Researchers called this tendency the interpreter, a system dedicated not to creating behavior, but to explaining it. And suddenly, a disturbing possibility emerged. What if much of what we call conscious thought works the same way? What if the inner voice is not generating experience? What if it is continuously narrating experience after it has already begun? Imagine watching a movie with a commentator describing every scene. After a while, you might start believing the commentator is controlling the story. But the film would continue even if the commentary disappeared. The narrator is not the source. The narrator is an observer. Modern theories of predictive processing push this idea even further. According to this framework, the brain is constantly constructing predictions about reality before conscious awareness ever becomes involved. It predicts what you will see, what you will hear, what you will feel, what you are likely to think. Consciousness does not receive raw reality. It receives a finished interpretation, a carefully constructed model generated by billions of unconscious computations. And thoughts may be no exception. What feels like spontaneous thinking could actually be the final stage of an enormous hidden process. A process that began long before awareness noticed the result. This helps explain a strange feature of mental life. You can observe thoughts appearing, but you cannot observe their creation. You can witness the outcome, but not the machinery. The factory remains hidden. Only the finished products arrive on the conveyor belt of consciousness. And because they appear inside awareness, we instinctively assume they belong to us. But ownership is not the same thing as authorship. A thought can appear within your mind without being consciously created by the self you identify as you. In fact, this may be happening every moment of every day. The voice in your head feels personal because it speaks in the first person. It says, "I think," "I want," "I believe," "I decided." Yet the evidence increasingly suggests that these statements may describe the experience of thought rather than its origin. The conscious self may not be the source of the river. It may simply be standing on the shore, watching it flow. And if the thinker is not creating thoughts, then the deepest mystery is no longer how thinking works. The deepest mystery is why the brain creates the feeling of being a thinker at all. That question leads us directly to the next stage of the puzzle. Because if the self is not controlling the process, what purpose does the illusion of control actually serve? If thoughts are not consciously created, if decisions begin before awareness notices them, if the voice in your head is more narrator than author, then what exactly are you? At first, these discoveries can feel deeply unsettling. They seem to threaten the very foundation of personal identity. For most of our lives, we imagine ourselves as the thinker behind our thoughts, the decision maker behind our actions, the conscious entity directing the flow of experience. And yet, the deeper we investigate, the harder this picture becomes to defend. But perhaps the problem is not that we have discovered something is missing. Perhaps the problem is that we were looking for the wrong thing. For centuries, people have searched the mind for a central self, a commander, an observer, a hidden homunculus sitting somewhere inside the brain. Yet every attempt to find such an entity has failed. Neuroscience cannot locate it. Psychology cannot isolate it. Philosophy cannot define it. The reason may be surprisingly simple. There was never a central controller to find, because the mind was never designed around a single controlling self. Instead, it appears to function as a process, a dynamic system composed of countless interacting mechanisms. Perception, memory, prediction, emotion, language, attention, each performing its role without requiring a central authority. A forest does not need a king tree. An ecosystem does not need a supreme animal directing every movement. Complex order can emerge naturally from countless smaller interactions. The brain may operate in much the same way. What we call self may simply be the experience produced by this coordination. Not an object, not a thing, a process. This perspective changes everything. Because once you stop searching for a thinker behind thought, a different question emerges. Who is experiencing all of this? The answer may be hidden in plain sight. Experience itself. Thoughts appear. Emotions arise. Sensations come and go. Awareness remains. The contents change constantly, but the fact of experiencing persists. Perhaps consciousness was never meant to control the process. Perhaps its role is something entirely different. Not command, not authorship. Observation, integration, adaptation. The conscious mind may function less like a CEO and more like a meeting place, a space where information becomes available to the wider system, a place where different processes can communicate and coordinate. From this perspective, thoughts do not need to be controlled in order to be useful. Just as your heart does not need conscious supervision to keep beating. Just as your immune system does not require permission to protect you. The unconscious mind may generate thoughts, because that is precisely what it evolved to do. Consciousness simply receives the results, and when necessary, uses them. This realization can feel strangely liberating, because it removes an impossible burden. The burden of believing you must consciously manufacture every thought, every idea, every emotion, every decision. In reality, much of life was always happening automatically. And perhaps that is not a flaw. Perhaps it is the source of human creativity itself. After all, where do breakthroughs come from? Where do sudden insights emerge? Where do solutions appear after hours of frustration? Again and again, the answer seems the same. They arrive unexpectedly, from somewhere beyond conscious control. The greatest ideas often appear when we stop trying to force them, when the hidden machinery of the mind is allowed to work uninterrupted. The unconscious is not your enemy. It is not a rival. It is the larger system from which conscious experience emerges. And understanding this may be the first step toward a healthier relationship with your own mind. Not as a commander trying to dominate every thought, but as an observer learning to work with a process far larger than itself. Imagine waking up tomorrow with a completely different understanding of your mind. The thoughts would still appear. The memories would still return. The inner voice would still speak. From the outside, nothing would seem different, and yet everything would have changed. Because you would no longer mistake the narrator for the author. You would no longer assume that every thought defines who you are. You would no longer feel obligated to identify with every mental event that passes through awareness. A thought appears, and instead of saying, "This is me," you simply notice, "This is a thought." A worry appears, a fear appears, an impulse appears, and for the first time, you recognize them as events rather than commands, as movements within the mind rather than expressions of a permanent self. This shift may seem subtle, but its consequences are profound. Many of our deepest forms of suffering begin with identification. We become fused with our thoughts. We believe every story the mind tells. We assume every fear is a prediction. Every criticism is a truth. Every impulse is an instruction. Yet the moment we begin observing thoughts instead of becoming them, something remarkable happens. A small distance appears. A space, a gap between awareness and mental activity. And within that space lies freedom. Not the freedom to control every thought, but the freedom not to be controlled by them. Perhaps this is the great irony of the human mind. The more desperately we try to become the thinker behind thought, the more confused we become. The more clearly we see thoughts for what they are, the more peaceful the mind becomes. The self may not be a commander. The voice in your head may not be the creator. The thinker may never have existed in the way you imagined, but that does not diminish the mystery. It deepens it, because now we are left with an even stranger possibility. A universe that has somehow become aware of itself. A mind observing its own activity. A process witnessing itself unfold in real time. And perhaps that is what you truly are. Not the thoughts, not the narrator, not the story, but the awareness in which all of them appear. The next thought is already on its way. You do not know what it will be. You cannot predict when it will arrive. You cannot see where it comes from. All you can do is wait. Watch carefully and notice the moment it appears, because hidden inside that simple moment is one of the deepest mysteries of being human, and it has been happening your entire life.